Well, thank you very much. I'm incredibly pleased to be here. It's a city I know very well, as you will hear. I've been many times, but just in the last couple of days, for the first time, I have an opportunity to talk in Vienna about my book East-West Street, which is published in German as Rückkehr nach Lemberg. I'm very, very pleased to be here. We are, each of us here, collectively as a group, but also each of us as an individual. And long ago I came to understand that my various activities, teaching, doing cases before international courts, and writing are in some way informed by my personal baggage, by my family and other backgrounds. Each of us has baggage that is attached to us when we come into the world. I was not a blank slate. The historian Eric Hobsbawm, who also knew Vienna well, wrote a biography called Interesting Times about his life in the 20th century. And in that book, he recognized the complex connection between who we are and what we do. He noted the profound way in which the interweaving of a person's life and times and his or her observation of both help to shape that person's sense of history. I'm not a historian, I'm a lawyer. And my work and my role in life is to understand how the law works, how rules are created, how they are interpreted, how they're applied, how they affect the behavior of international actors, from states to institutions to individuals. My curiosity about a person's life and times concerns the way it might inform the world, and the experiences of the past quarter of a century in my work, not least appearing in many international courts before judges from many different backgrounds and many different countries, points to a rather clear conclusion. Individual lives and personal histories can make a very significant difference to outcomes. East-West Street took nearly 7 years for me to write. It's not about the life of four people. It's not about the life of one person, but about four people. And it seeks to understand how the roads traveled by these four people changed the system of international law, which is my daily work. The book also touches on a much more personal theme, how the four interweaving lives of these people influence the path that I've taken. Below the two sets of stories in East-West Street lurk some much bigger questions, questions that touch each and every one of us in this room. A central question of identity. Who am I? Who am I, and how do I wish to be defined in international law? Am I more an individual, or am I a member of a group? And if the latter, which group? How do I want the law to protect me? Do I want the law to protect me because of my qualities as an individual human being, or do I want the law to protect me because I'm a member of one or more groups? These are big issues right now in Austria, in Britain, in the United States, in many countries, in every country around the world. East-West Street began entirely by chance. Let's go back to the spring of 2010. I was immersed in my world, teaching at the university, like over here in London, writing academic articles, doing cases in The Hague. An invitation arrived from Ukraine. It was an email from the law faculty of the university in a city that used to be called Lemberg when it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until 1918, and then became Lvov until 1939 when it was part of Poland, and then after 1945 it was called Lviv, which is what it is called today. Would I come to Lviv and deliver a lecture on the work that I do on crimes against humanity and genocide? Would I come and talk about the cases I have done, and the books and articles that I have written, could I come and talk about the Nuremberg trial, which I have written about? Yes, I said, I would be very pleased to come to Lviv to talk about all of these things. I was long interested in Nuremberg, the trial, the words, the images, the sounds. The Nuremberg trial in 1945 was absolutely catalytic. It was the moment when our modern system of international justice, such as it is, crystallized into being. I was fascinated by the tiny points of detail, by the lengthy transcripts, by the terrible evidence, by the books, by the memoirs, by the diaries that laid out in forensic detail what was put before the judges, the personal stories that went on in and outside the courtroom. I was drawn to films like Judgment at Nuremberg, made in 1961, which won an Oscar and which was made memorable, amongst other things, by Spencer Tracy's closing line at the end of the film, where he says, speaking as a judge, "We stand for truth, justice, and the value of a single human life." There was also a practical reason for my interest. The trial's influence on my own work had been profound. The judgment at Nuremberg in October 1946 basically created the modern system of human rights. It is true that there was a whiff of justice, victor's justice, about the trial, but the case was absolutely catalytic. It opened up the possibility for the first time in human history, first time ever, that an international court would put on trial the leader or leaders of a country. I think I was invited to Lviv because of my work as a barrister, rather than my academic writings. I'd been involved in 1998 in the creation of the International Criminal Court, now in The Hague, which has jurisdiction over both crimes against humanity and justice, as well as 2 other crimes. What's the difference between crimes against humanity and justice? The essential difference is on who is protected and why. Assume that 10,000 people are killed, murdered, exterminated in any part of the world, South America, Syria, Iraq, today. The systematic killing of such a large number of people will always be a crime against humanity. But will it be a genocide in international law? That depends on the intentions of the people who kill and the ability of prosecutors to prove that intention. To establish the crime of genocide in international law, you have to show that the act of killing is motivated by a particular special intention, the intention to destroy a group in whole or in part. If a criminal prosecutor cannot prove that intention, and it's a very difficult thing to prove because most people do not leave around pieces of paper saying, this is why I am doing what I am doing. If a criminal prosecutor can't prove that special intention, then the crime of genocide is not established. And so you have these 2 international crimes operating side by side. Crimes against humanity, which is about the protection of individuals, and genocide, which is about the protection of groups. Every genocide is also a crime against humanity, but not every crime against humanity is a genocide. A few months after the 2 crimes were introduced into the statute of the International Criminal Court, Senator Pinochet was arrested in London on charges of genocide and crimes against humanity, laid against him by a Spanish prosecutor. The House of Lords, the highest court in England, ruled that even as a former president of Chile, Pinochet could not claim immunity from the jurisdiction of the English courts. That was a total, novel, and revolutionary judgment. Slowly after 1998, the gates of international justice began to creak open after 50 years of inaction following the Nuremberg trial. And cases from around the world started coming onto my desk, my lawyer's desk, in London. Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Congo, Libya, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Sierra Leone, Guantanamo, Iraq, Palestine, Israel, and many, many more cases. They were based on these two new rules that were created after 1945, that revolutionary moment in international law when it was recognized for the first time that the sovereignty of the state was not absolute. The position until 1939 in international law was clear and it was simple. If a state decided that half the people in a room were going to be executed tomorrow, the people on that side of the room, and these people would live, as a matter of international law, the state was free to act in that way. People were the property of the state. And if the state wished to treat its people in that way, international law was silent. That changed in 1945. The long and sad list of cases that reached my desk reflected the failure of good intentions, aired in Nuremberg's courtroom 600. Some of the cases in which I was involved concerned crimes against humanity, the protection of individuals. Others concerned genocide, the destruction of groups. The two distinct crimes emphasize, on the one hand, the individual, on the other hand, the group. They grew side by side, but over time, the crime of genocide has emerged in the eyes of many people as the crime of crimes, a suggestion, an unhappy suggestion, that somehow the killing of large numbers of people as individuals is less terrible than the killing of people because they are a member of a group. Occasionally in my work I would pick up details about the origins and purposes of these two crimes, invented in 1945, which first appeared in courtroom 600. But I never looked too deeply as to the origins of both crimes or what had exactly happened in the Nuremberg trial. I knew generally how the concepts had been created, but I didn't know the personal stories and I didn't know the arguments at Nuremberg. So the invitation from Lviv gave me a chance to explore both those issues. Now, I could say that I had... Here you are, that's fine. I could say that I went to Lviv to give a lecture about the work that I did, but that would not be true. I really went to Lviv because of this person. This is my grandfather, when he was 10 years old. It's his school card taken in Vienna, here in this city, in 1914. His name was Leon Buchholz, and he was born in Lemberg in 1904. And the reason that I accepted the invitation was very simple. I wanted to find the house where my grandfather was born. He never spoke to me of Lemberg, Lviv, or Lvov. In his wonderful slim volume, the Polish poet Joseph Witlin, a book called Mój Lwów, Meine Lemberg, published in 1946, described the essence of a Lwovian, an extraordinary mixture of nobility and roguery, of wisdom and imbecility, of poetry and vulgarity, he wrote. A place of nostalgia, a nostalgia that likes to create false flavors, telling us to think only of the sweetness of Lvov today. But, Witlin concludes, I know people for whom Lvov was a cup of gall. And it was a cup of gall for my grandfather, buried very deep, part of a hinterland of which he never ever spoke to me. I knew him until 1997 when he died. He was totally silent about everything that happened before 1945. His silence covered the wounds in the best way that they could for him of a family that he left behind when he left Lemberg in 1914 to travel here to Vienna in 1914 and then lost forever when he left this city, Vienna, in 1939. The moment I first arrived in Vienna, in Lemberg, in October 2010, it felt incredibly familiar, like going back to a place that somehow I knew, and I felt comfortable there. Why I had that reaction when I arrived for the first time in Lemberg is a complex matter. It caused me to explore, with the help of friends who are psychologists and psychoanalysts, the writings, in particular, of psychoanalysts who explore the relationship not between parent and child, but between grandparent and grandchild. And in fact, two Hungarian psychoanalysts, Maria Torok and Nicholas Abraham, had written extensively on this important relationship. And from that work, I drew certain ideas that influenced my book. They wrote that what haunts us are the gaps left within us by the secrets of others. And those are the words with which East-West Street, Rückkehr nach Lemberg, opens. My grandfather's secret was that he came from a huge family, more than 80 people. Uncles, aunts, cousins, parents, nephews, nieces, and more distant relatives. The family grew and grew in and around Lemberg until 1939, when war returned once more to the city. Within 6 years of the war beginning, by end of 1945, he was the only member of the family who was still alive. He was the only survivor from Galicia. In 1939, he was expelled, if you like, for the second time. And in preparing to go to Lemberg for the first time, I asked my mother if she had any papers relating to that period, because I wanted to find the house where he lived. And she came into her living room with 2 big bags of papers, and I had never seen these. I was 50 years old by then. I'd never seen any of this material. And included in the material, I found this document. It is the order expelling him from Vienna in November 1938. I don't need to translate it for you. You understand it very, very clearly. But in English, what it says is that the Jew Buchholz Morris Leon shall leave the territory of the German Reich by December the 25th, 1938. The reason he could be expelled was that shortly before that, he had been made stateless. His nationality was removed from him. He was Polish. He was married to an Austrian, my grandmother. But he could be made stateless. And because he could be made stateless, he could be expelled. That is one of the reasons I have become so concerned about what is happening in other countries around the world right now, including the United Kingdom. And I've been very loud and outspoken on the case involving the young British woman, Shamima Begum, who 2 weeks ago had her British nationality stripped by the British government to stop her returning from Syria, where she had gone to associate herself with ISIS, because she was no longer a British national. Because of the events that happened in 1939 and subsequently, in 1961 an international convention was adopted which makes it illegal to strip a person of their nationality if they will be made stateless. And in my view, the decision taken by the British government is totally illegal, unjustifiable, unsupportable, and wrong. And it has to be reacted to incredibly strongly. And there are moves in other countries, including in Austria, to move along the same lines. This document is one of the reasons I feel so strongly about statelessness. What is used against one group of people in one place and in 1 year will be used against another group of people at another place and another time. And it has to be defended against and responded to. I had always assumed that when my grandfather left this city in January 1939, he left with his family, his wife, my grandmother, Regina, and his daughter, my mother, Ruth, who was 6 months old. But in going through the papers in November 2010, I learnt for the first time that that is not what happened. My grandfather left by himself. His daughter stayed behind, and his wife stayed behind. Only with these papers did I learn what happened. My mother stayed until July 1939 and then travelled to Paris by herself, aged 1. How did that happen? My grandmother remained in Vienna until November 1941. She was Jewish. Why did she not travel with her daughter and her husband? I wanted to know what happened. And I came to understand that something had happened in the family that caused a silence between my grandparents, and about which my mother said she knew nothing. Why did my grandfather Leon leave by himself? How did my mother Ruth get from Vienna to Paris? Why did my grandmother Rita, Regina, remain in Vienna? How was she able to allow herself to be separated from her only child? These are very big questions, and they required examination. I went back to the documents in my grandfather's papers looking for clues. I'm a litigator, a courtroom lawyer, which is a sort of amateur, lesser historian come psychiatrist. And you learn with pieces of paper that every document and every photograph is capable of telling a story that you do not immediately know what it means. It's called the muck of evidence, and I love it. It's my job. I've learned with this material, you have to keep an open mind always. You have to look carefully. You have to attend to the unexpected, find the dots, try to join them, and be persistent. But I have learned from my work that nothing is only ever quite what it seems. And 2 items stood out. This was the first one. A tiny piece of paper, 2 centimetres by 3 centimetres, folded in half. One side was blank, and the other had a name and address written firmly in pencil. Miss E.M. Tilney, Manuka, Bluebell Road, Norwich, Angleterre. And the second thing that I noticed was this document, a photograph, also tiny, 2 centimetres by 3 centimetres, taken in 1949, a middle-aged man, Viennese, staring intently into the camera. On the back of the photograph was written in blue ink, Herzliche Grüße aus Wien, September 1949. Warmest wishes from Vienna. There was a signature, but the name was indecipherable. I asked my mother, what is this piece of paper? Who is Miss Tilney? Who is this man? My mother said she didn't know, but I didn't quite believe her. So I kept the 2 pieces of paper above my desk and decided I would come back to them to explore, like a detective, what these documents were about. They stayed there for 4 years, which was how long it took me to find out what these things were about. I've taken you on a little detour. Let's go back to the lecture that I was due to give in Lviv on crimes against humanity and genocide. Let me take you to the first of many amazing coincidences. In preparing that lecture back in 2010, I was surprised, astonished even, to learn that the man who invented the concept of crimes against humanity and put it into international law came from Lemberg. Indeed, he was a student at the very university that had invited me to give the lecture, but the people at the university did not know that fact. His name was Hirsch Lauterpacht. He was born in a small town called Żółkiew, remember the name, about 15 miles, 25 kilometers north of Lemberg. He moved to Lemberg when he was 14 in 1911, enrolled as a student at the law faculty in 1915, And in 1919 came here to Vienna, where he spent 4 years studying with the professor and constitutional theorist Hans Kelsen, who drafted the first Austrian constitution. He came to London in 1923 with his new wife, and he became a renowned scholar of international law. He is quite simply the greatest international lawyer of the 20th century. He started at the London School of Economics and then got a chair in international law at Cambridge University. And in 1945, he published a book that was absolutely revolutionary. It was called An International Bill of the Rights of Man. And it was the first book ever to put forward the idea that every human being on the planet has minimum rights because they are an individual human being. Rights from which the state is unable to depart under any circumstances. In April 1945, after the war in Europe ended, and by which point Lauterpacht's ideas had been integrated into the United Nations Charter with the idea of human rights, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin agreed that there would be a trial for senior Nazi lawyers. And the British government hired Hersch Lauterpacht, professor at Cambridge University, to join their prosecution team at Nuremberg. He worked with Robert Jackson, the chief prosecutor in the Nuremberg trial. In July 1945, Jackson travelled to London to draft the charter of the Nuremberg Tribunal. The four powers, America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, disagreed about the list of crimes which would be prosecuted in relation to the defendants. And so Jackson turned to Lauterpacht for help. He went up to Cambridge on July the 29th and sat in the garden of Lauterpacht's house. Here you see Lauterpacht in his garden in 1945. The two men discussed the list of crimes. Lauterpacht thought it would be a good idea to insert titles into the statute to help public understanding. Jackson reacted positively, and so Lauterpacht raised another idea in respect of atrocities committed against civilians, a matter on which the Soviets and the Americans were completely divided. Why not, he said, why not refer to atrocities committed against civilians as crimes against humanity? That was his idea, and put it into the Nuremberg statute. Here you see the words for the first time written by Hersch Lauterpacht in his own handwriting in 1945. Jackson liked the idea, took it back to London, and a week later the concept of crimes against humanity was incorporated into the Nuremberg statute, and for the first time in history of law was used as a legal concept to connote wrongdoing against large numbers of individuals. You'll recall that the lecture that I was going to give also addressed a second concept, genocide, the protection of groups. So let's address the second surprise that I came to. That word was invented in November 1944. And guess what? The man who invented it also came from Lemberg and studied at the same law faculty as Lauterpacht, although not at the same time. He arrived in 1921, 2 years after Lauterpacht left. His name was Raphael Lemkin. And as with Lauterpacht, the people at the law school who invited me did not know that he had been a student at Lvov University. After he left in 1926, he became a public prosecutor, having obtained a doctorate in criminal law. In 1933, he wrote a paper for a League of Nations meeting in Madrid. He proposed a list of new international crimes to combat barbarity and vandalism. Unlike Lauterpacht, his focus was not on the protection of individuals, but on the protection of groups. The timing was terrible. Hitler had just taken power in Germany. Nothing came of the idea. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Lemkin was in Warsaw. he escaped. He made his way to Sweden, where he spent a few months, taught at the university there, and eventually left Stockholm in the spring of 1941 for the United States. Because Europe was closed, he traveled the long route across the whole of the Soviet Union to Japan, and then by boat to Seattle, then train to Durham, North Carolina, and Duke University Law School, where he got refugee status as an academic. He traveled with no money and no personal belongings, but a huge quantity of luggage. The suitcases he traveled with were filled with nothing but paper, because he had spent the months in Stockholm gathering all the decrees he could find that had been promulgated by the Nazis across occupied Europe. He took them to America, analyzed them, and in 1942 was offered a contract to write a book that would describe the pattern of behavior followed by the Nazis across Europe. The book was published in November 1944. It was called Axis Rule of Occupied Europe, and chapter 9 of the book was given a new word as the title: genocide, a word invented by Raphael Lemkin and used for the first time in November 1944. He invented it by creating an amalgam of a Latin word, side, meaning killing, and a Greek word, genos, meaning group. This is Lemkin's own handwriting, dating back to 1945, of the concept. In the summer of 1945, Lemkin was hired by the Americans to work with Jackson on the prosecution of Nazi defendants at Nuremberg. He pushed for his idea of genocide, a crime for which he wanted the senior Nazis to be indicted, and in his definition, it included the destruction of all groups. He focused on 3 in his work at the time: Poles, Jews, and Roma. But for him, it covered any particular grouping of human beings who were targeted. The term genocide did not make it into the Nuremberg Statute, so he traveled to London and worked on the indictment of the individual defendants. And he managed to persuade the 4 negotiating powers to include it in the indictment. He was persistent, overcame the opposition from the United States and Southern senators who were worried that the concept of genocide would be used by African Americans in the United States context, and overcame the objections of the British, who worried that it would be used by people living in British colonies against British rule. It was included as a count of a war crime, and it was included and argued for the first time in 1945 in the Nuremberg trial. I went to London. I succeeded in having inscribed the charge of genocide against the Nazi war criminals in Nuremberg, Lemkin would later say. The Nuremberg trial opened on the 20th of November 1945. Lauterpacht was present in the courtroom. He was a member of the British team. Lemkin remained in Washington, D.C., working in the War Department. Lauterpacht pushing for the protection of individuals, crimes against humanity. Lemkin pushing for genocide, the protection of groups. Now, my book involves, as I told you, 4 men. I've talked about the first, my grandfather. The second is Lauterpacht. The third is Lemkin. And the fourth is this man, Hans Frank, who was one of the 22 men in the dock in November 1945 when the trial opened. Hans Frank was a lawyer. He was German. He had been to some of the finest law schools in that country, and from 1928 served as Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer. In 1933, he became Bavarian Minister of Justice, and in 1939 became governor of the Gouvernement Général, Nazi-occupied Poland. On the 1st of August 1942, he visited Lemberg, which had been incorporated into District Galicia and into the government general, for which he was responsible as sovereign. He hosted a concert, he brought Beethoven to Lemberg, and gave a series of speeches in which he announced the total elimination of the region's entire Jewish population, more than 500,000 people. Over the next 6 months, those who would get caught up in the horror and the mayhem were the entire families and friends and teachers of Lauterpacht and Lemkin, as well as my grandfather Leon's family. For each of the 3 families, there would only be a single survivor. 3 years later, in May 1945, Hans Frank was caught by the US Army in Schliersee at his home south of Munich. He had with him 42 volumes of his diaries and a fantastic collection of artwork. And when I say fantastic, I mean completely fantastic. It included, for example, this portrait by Leonardo da Vinci of Cecilia Gallerani, the lady with an ermine. This painting hung in Hans Frank's private office in the Wawel Castle in Krakow. I've come to know Hans Frank's son Nicholas. He has become a friend. And he tells me that when he was a little boy, his father would make him stand in front of this painting and slick down his hair like Cecilia Gallerani. And as a little boy, aged 4, he was frightened of the creature which he thought was a strange rat. It's actually an ermine. But Frank was now caught, and he was a defendant in Nuremberg, charged with crimes against humanity and genocide. On the first day of the trial, the Soviet prosecutors described to the judges what had happened in Lemberg after August 1942. More than 130,000 people were killed in just a few weeks, including nearly 10,000 children, right at the heart of the city. Lauterpacht I knew to be in court that day, and I imagined whether he knew that what the Soviet prosecutors were addressing were possibly his own family as victims. But the reality is that on the opening days of the trial, neither Lauterpacht nor Lemkin knew that the man they were prosecuting, Hans Frank, had played a central role in the destruction of their own families. On this day, November the 20th, 1945, the terms genocide and crimes against humanity were used in open court for the first time. I knew that Lauterpacht and Frank were both in the courtroom, and I wanted to see a photograph of them together. I asked Lauterpacht's son, his only child, Eli Lauterpacht, whether there was a photograph of Lauterpacht, his father, and Frank together. He said there was none, and rather like my mother, I didn't believe him. I spent a lot of time looking for photographs, and eventually I found a photograph which showed both men in the same room together. If you look in the top left-hand corner, you will see Lauterpacht sitting at the British delegation of prosecutors. He's attentive, sitting behind a Soviet council. If you move your eyes to the lower left-hand corner, you will see Hans Frank in the bottom left-hand corner. Divided by no more than a few tables and chairs, Lauterpacht and Frank are together in the same room. But at the moment this photograph is taken, they do not know of the relationship they have. The trial will last a full year. Judgment is handed down over 2 days, September the 30th and October the 1st, 1946. I don't have time to go into the details of what happened in that remarkable year, as the lives of the 3 men, Lauterpacht, Lemkin and Frank, became increasingly intertwined. Suffice it to say that the connections were totally unexpected, a series of happenings which the historian Antony Beevor has described as being of a kind that no novel could ever possibly match. The point is that that these personal journeys coincided in ways that changed the course of legal history and then history itself. The ideas and endeavours of Lauterpacht and Lemkin influenced politics, history, culture, my life, and your lives. The concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide have entered our world, although many people are under the impression they've existed forever. That is not the case. Both terms, genocide and crimes against humanity, are inventions, the product of creative minds, of two men driven by their own personal experiences, forged on the anvil of a single city, Lemberg. Why Lauterpacht opted for the protection of the individual and what caused Lemkin to embrace the protection of the group is a matter of speculation. The two men had similar backgrounds, they studied at the same university, they even had the same teachers at the university. If you want to trace the origins of their ideas and these two crimes, as I have done, you can trace them to the city of Lemberg and to events after the end of the First World War, to the law faculty. You can even trace them to a single teacher the two men had in common, a Polish professor of criminal law, Julius Makarevich's. And you can follow the line to Julius Makarevich's classroom, which I found, having looked for it, and is still a working classroom today in the city of Lemberg, essentially unchanged. There's something else that's remarkable, it seems to me. Despite their common origins, despite their common interests, despite their similar journeys, despite the fact that I sometimes locate the two men, Lauterpacht and Lemkin, in the same city on the same day, although never in Nuremberg and never in courtroom 600, where they kept missing each other, sometimes by just a few hours. It seems that Lauterpacht and Lemkin never actually met. But the concepts they put into international law inform my everyday working life, and I frequently wondered how it could be that I ended up doing the work that I do. My quest to understand Lauterpacht and Lemkin must surely in some way be driven by my own personal history, by stories that were buried deep in a family crypt of silence, no doubt for the best of protective reasons, that is deeply connected to this city of Vienna. But I carry on doing the family detective work, and I managed to discover who Miss Tilney was and what she did, and came to understand why my mother and I and my brother have reason to be hugely grateful to a truly remarkable and courageous woman who was a missionary, an evangelical Christian missionary, who worked on behalf of the Surrey Chapel in Norwich. She was motivated by the sermons of her pastor, David Panton, and in particular his interpretation of chapter 10, verse 1 of Paul's letter to the Romans. A single line, it seems, which motivated her to travel from Paris to Vienna in July 1939 and bring back two small children from this city to Paris and save their lives. One of the children refused to come and would perish 2 years later in the ghetto of Litzmannstadt. The second child was my mother, and she survived. Miss Tilney, whose history I became so interested in, I followed all the way through, had worked as a missionary in North Africa, trying to bring Jews and Muslims to Jesus. And one of the things I was interested in was what motivated her to act as she did at risk of her own life in the summer of 1939. And I took advice from people who knew far better than I the world in which she lived, and in particular a novelist, a famous English novelist called Jeanette Winterson, whose mother was also an evangelical British, who explained to me that ultimately she believed Miss Tilney was not motivated by ideology of any kind, religious or other, but pure humanitarian instinct. And she saved a lot of people, not just Jewish people, in doing what she did. I also, this is Miss Tilney, just so that you get a sense of what she's like. And she does have, I think, a remarkable face. And she is the character in the book who has become, I think, most beloved. I get more letters about her than about anyone else. The city of Norwich has honoured her as a result of the book, which came out in England 3 years ago. And the city has actually wanted to construct a statue of her to put up in the city centre. But the community, the Surrey Chapel, which I've come to know very well, and I go once a year and give a sermon, which is a wonderful thing, has refused. They are against idolatry. And they said, we'll just have a piece of paper to put on the wall of our congregation, and that will be sufficient. We do not want a statue. I also uncovered the identity of the man in the bow tie, and that was a much, much more complicated story and took even longer. It was a journey that took me east and then west, across rivers, across an ocean. I had to go through dozens of old Austrian and Viennese telephone directories. I hired a private detective in the city of Vienna, and I then, I'm sorry to say, achieved success in identifying the man with the use of Facebook, and ended up in an attic in Massapequa, Long Island, in New York State, where I came to know the granddaughter of the man on the right, who is the man in the photograph, whose name is Emil Lindenfeld. This photograph was taken in the spring of 1941 in the garden of what we believe to be number 4 Brahmsplatz in this city. And the man on the right, Emil Lindenfeld, was my grandmother's lover. And that was why she stayed. I learned a lot from this photograph that I had not understood. I've come to understand the meaning of wearing white socks and what it meant back in the 1930s and 40s, a symbol of support for the Nazis. I didn't know that. And I've also come to understand the source of my mother's anxiety, which was her fear that the reason her mother chose to stay in Vienna was that she had a lover, and the lover was a Nazi. That photograph would tend to support that theory, but the reality was that Lindenfeld, on the right, was not a Nazi. He was Jewish, and he was in hiding, and he became a U-boat a year after this photograph was taken, and then somehow survived. That photograph took a long time to find, and it helped me unravel a family mystery in parallel to the bigger political story. Now, perhaps even more remarkably, and again unexpectedly, I came to learn of the more direct connections between my family, the Buchholzes and the Flaschners, and the Lauterpacks and the Lemkins. I was very surprised to discover over the years with all of this material that my great-grandmother, my grandfather Leon's mother, Amalia Flaschner, who became Amalia Buchholz, was not from Lemberg at all, but was born in the small town of Żółkiew, which you will remember is the place where Hirsch Lauterpacht was born. How amazing, I thought. Why is that amazing? It's amazing because my first teacher of international law was Eli Lauterpacht, the only child of Hirsch Lauterpacht. I studied with him in 1981 for the first time. In 1984, he offered me my first teaching job at Cambridge University. We worked together for 33 years. And it was only in 2014 that I learned that his father, Hirsch Lauterpacht, and my great-grandmother, Amalia Flaschner Buchholz came from the same small town, population 6,000. Not only that, they actually came from the same street, Lemberger Straße, the street to Lemberg, the street that Joseph Roth, the great writer, described as East-West Street in one of his articles, hence the title of the book. Then I discovered that Amalia Flaschner Buchholz, whose life started on this street, the street of the Lauterpags, ended on the same street as the Lemkins. Amalia Flaschner Buchholz came to this city in the summer of 1914 after the Russians occupied Lemberg. She lived here until the summer of 1942, when she was deported to Theresienstadt. And on the 23rd of September 1942, she was transported on the same transport as the three sisters of Sigmund Freud to Treblinka, where she left the train and immediately walked down Himmelfahrtstraße, the street to heaven, and into a gas chamber where she was gassed to death on the afternoon of the 23rd of September 1942. Less than a month later, Lemkin's parents, Bella and Joseph, were transported to the same railway platform, walked down the same street, and were gassed to death in the same gas chamber as Amalia Flaschner Buchholz. In this strange way, my great-grandmother's life was bookended by the street of the Lauterpags and the street of the Lemkins, as my life is in a different way. How do you begin to understand these points of connection, of personal history and intellectual history? The starting point, of course, is the ideas of these two remarkable men, Lauterpact and Lemkin, and the enduring relevance of their ideas today. Lauterpact believed that we must concentrate on the protection of the individual. And I think he would argue today still that Lemkin's invention, the concept of genocide, the protection of the group, is both useless in practical terms, in stopping atrocity, and dangerous in political terms, because it will replace, on his view, the tyranny of the state with the tyranny of the group. And I have to say, my own work doing cases on genocide in Bosnia, in Yugoslavia, in Croatia, in Kosovo, in Cambodia, reinforces my sense that Lauterpact was probably right. I've seen firsthand for myself that by focusing on the protection of one group against another, there is a tendency to reinforce the sense of them and us, to amplify the power of group identity and association, which is both a source of sustenance and support on the one hand, but great danger on the other hand. I don't need to explain to you in this room, you understand very well what I'm talking about. How does this happen in law? It happens because in seeking to prove a genocide, you have to establish the existence and expression of an intention to destroy a group in whole or in part. And I've seen for myself in doing cases that by trying to gather the evidence to prove that intention, you reinforce the sense of victimhood of the targeted group and hatred towards the perpetrators as another group. On the other hand, I understand exactly what Lemkin was trying to do. He rightly recognized the reality that in most cases of mass atrocity, actually I think in all of them, the targeted group is targeted not because of a hatred of individuals, but because they happen to be a member of a group that is hated at a particular moment in time or in place. And Lemkin would say, and it is a powerful argument, that the law must reflect that reality. It must recognize and give legitimacy to feelings that each and every one of us have of association with one or more groups. That said, I am concerned about the hierarchy that seems to have emerged, one that puts genocide at the top of the pyramid on the list of horrors, so that a mere crime against humanity or a war crime is somehow seen as a lesser evil. Call something a genocide and it is on page 1 of a newspaper. Call it a crime against humanity and it probably won't make it into the newspapers at all. That is the power of the word created by Raphael Lemkin. Today, as every one of us in this room knows too well, the poison of xenophobia, nationalism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism is back, coursing its way through the veins of Europe and many other parts of the world. The strong man is back. I see that on my journeys around our European continent. I see it in England, I see it here, I see it in the United States, I see it in Hungary, I see it in Ukraine. Those of you who've seen my film about the book made by the BBC called My Nazi Legacy, my relationship with the son of Hans Frank, Nicholas, and the son of Otto Wächter, his deputy, Horst. I'm so very glad that his daughter is here with us today because Horst too has become a dear friend of mine, will have seen me in the summer of 2014 standing in a field outside Lemberg, watching people dressed in SS uniforms celebrating the creation of the Waffen-SS Galicia Division. I've seen it too, more recently, on my journeys in making a BBC radio and podcast series called The Rat Line, which is the subject of the sequel to East West Street, which will be published in English next year and in German probably the year after. Travelling across Europe, travelling in Austria, travelling in Poland, travelling in Britain, travelling in France, it's hard to avoid what seems to be stirring. It's hard to avoid wondering to where this is going to lead. The generation that experienced the horrors of the 1930s, the generation that lived through the Second World War, the generation that knows why governments came together in 1945 to create a United Nations, to adopt in 1948 in this room in Paris a Universal Declaration on Human Rights and a Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, that generation is about to disappear. And with their disappearance, actual memory of what human beings are able to do themselves on this continent is going to be gone. And that has created a space. And into that space, some of our leaders are marching. Perhaps the disappearance of actual memory, of actual experience, is what will allow our politicians to take for granted what happened in 1945 and the effort in that room to say, we will not let these things happen again. It's impossible for me not to have gone through the experience of writing East West Street and the projects that followed, an immersion in the world centering around Vienna of the years between 1914 and 1945, and not feel an acute sense of anxiety as to what is stirring. 2 years ago, the man who is now the President of the United States called for a total and complete shutdown for Muslims entering the United States. The idea of targeting people, not because of what they have done, not because of their individual actions or propensities, but simply because they happen to be a member of a particular group, has a long, dark, and terrible history. The Italian writer Primo Levi, who spent a year at Auschwitz, put the point very crisply in the preface to his remarkable book, If This Is a Man, published in 1947. He wrote, "Many people, many nations can find themselves holding more or less wittingly that every stranger is an enemy. As soon as that happens," he continued, "when the unspoken dogma becomes the major premise in a syllogism, then at the end of the chain, inevitably, there is the concentration camp. One thing leads to another." Against this background, the idea of a travel ban based on a person's nationality or religion is deeply troubling. Experience teaches us to know where such a beginning can lead to, singling out people not for what they might have done, but because they happen to be a member of a particular group. And many of you in this room will know to where such a beginning can lead. One thing leads to another. In my country, it's possible too to smell change in the air, a move to identity politics. If you believe you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere, the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, told her party conference 2 years ago. Her words reminded me of a passage in the one book I tell my students they must read right now, Stefan Zweig's The World of Yesterday, published in 1942, just after he had committed suicide. Required readings for our times, I am sorry to say, today. "For almost half a century," he wrote, "I trained my heart to beat as the heart of a citizen of the world. On the day I lost my Austrian passport, I discovered that when you lose your native land, you are losing more than a patch of territory set within borders." This is the context in which I think about the views of Lauterpacht and Lemkin and oscillate between their competing views, between the protection of the individual and the protection of the group. The realism of Lemkin, the idealism of Lauterpacht. And I can see the force of both their arguments. And I can recognize the tension and the struggle between the individual and the group, between crimes against humanity and genocide. It is not a struggle or a tension that will soon be resolved. And that's why international law today continues to embrace both contexts. This is the context in which I end East-West Street, in Zhorkiev, standing at a mass grave in which the bodies of Lauterpacht's family and of my grandfather's family rest today, 70 years later, unburied, unmarked, forgotten in disgrace. I find myself standing there, caught between different instincts, between my head and my heart, between my intellect and my instinct, recognizing the need to value the inherent worth of every individual human being, but also understanding the pull of tribal loyalty, the essential truth of the notion that each of us, in our own ways, differently, is haunted by the gaps left within us by the secrets of others, but also strengthened by the possibility of knowing that the discovery of the existence of such a haunting will not necessarily destroy us, but could actually make us stronger. Thank you so much for listening.